It doesn't usually start with support, applause, or encouragement. In most cases, it starts with silence, awkward smiles, and people pretending to take your words lightly while already deciding in their mind that it will never happen. You speak about your dreams, your direction, the version of yourself you're trying to build, and instead of curiosity, you are met with subtle dismissal. Not always direct criticism, but something more dangerous than that, low-level mockery disguised as realism. They don't attack your vision openly, they shrink it quietly. A small laugh here, a doubtful comment there, a look that says be serious without ever saying the words. And in that environment, your future is not judged based on what it could become, but based on who you are right now in their eyes. That is the first mistake they make, because they assume your current position is your final form. They measure your potential using your present conditions, your current resources, your current results, and they use that as evidence to decide how far you can go. And when your vision doesn't match their limited understanding, they don't expand their thinking, they reduce yours. They file it under unrealistic, overthinking, or not grounded in reality, not because your idea lacks value, but because their perception cannot stretch far enough to see it clearly. What they don't realize in that moment is that this reaction says more about their limitation than your capability. Because anyone can understand what already exists, but very few people can recognize what is still in development. And so, without knowing it, they place you into a category they feel comfortable with, not one that reflects where you are actually heading. Meanwhile, something important happens internally within you during that same period. While they are forming opinions, you are forming direction. While they are making jokes, you are making adjustments. While they are analyzing your current situation, you are quietly building the next version of yourself in the background. And the gap between what they see and what you are becoming begins to grow silently. But at this stage, none of it is visible yet, which is exactly why their reaction feels so confident. Because people rarely question what hasn't shown results yet. They only respond to what they can already measure. And in their mind, they believe they have already understood your limits, not realizing they are only looking at the starting point of a path they haven't even begun to follow. While their opinion about you stays fixed at the level of doubt, something completely different begins happening in the background of your life. Something they are not close enough to see. And honestly, something they are not even thinking about because they have already mentally categorized you as figured out. This is where the silent phase begins. The part nobody claps for, nobody comments on, and nobody pays attention to because it does not produce immediate results that can be shown or validated. But this is exactly the phase where everything starts changing. You continue moving forward without announcing anything, without seeking approval, and without trying to convince anyone that your direction is real. Instead, you enter a mode where your attention becomes more selective, your habits become more intentional, and your thinking starts shifting from emotional reaction to long-term construction. Every decision begins to carry weight, even the small ones, because you start realizing that consistency in private eventually becomes evidence in public. And while others are busy forming opinions about where you are going, you are already adjusting the internal structure of how you will get there. There is no noise in this phase, no external validation, no visible recognition, just repetition, correction, learning, and quiet persistence that doesn't look impressive from the outside, but is extremely powerful over time. What makes this stage so important is that nothing about it is designed to be noticed early. It is designed to compound silently, like something building beneath the surface where nobody is measuring progress yet, so nobody takes it seriously. But internally, you are not the same person anymore. The way you interpret situations starts changing. The way you respond to setbacks becomes more calculated, and the way you view your own potential becomes less dependent on other people's opinions. You stop treating every comment as feedback and start filtering everything through your own internal standard. And slowly, without making it obvious, your actions begin to separate from your old identity. The habits that used to define you start falling away, and new patterns begin replacing them. Not in a dramatic transformation, but in small, almost unnoticeable shifts that accumulate over time. Meanwhile, the people who mocked your direction are still operating on their original assumption. They are still referencing the version of you that existed before this silent evolution began, which means their entire perception of you is essentially frozen in time. They don't see the adjustments, they don't see the discipline, and they don't see the internal restructuring happening beneath the surface. So when they think about you, they are not thinking about who you are becoming. They are thinking about who you were when they last felt confident enough to judge you. And that gap between perception and reality starts widening quietly. Because while they remain mentally static about your potential, you are becoming increasingly dynamic in your execution. Your focus sharpens in ways they cannot measure. Your patience increases in ways they would not expect. And your willingness to delay validation in exchange for real progress becomes your strongest advantage. You stop rushing for proof and start building systems that will eventually produce undeniable proof on their own. And in this stage, something very subtle but powerful happens. Your life stops being about responding to opinions and starts becoming about constructing outcomes. And that shift, even though it is invisible to others, is exactly what begins separating you from the version of yourself they thought they understood. As time continues to move forward, something begins to shift in a way that neither you nor the people who once dismissed you fully notice at first. It doesn't happen as a sudden realization, but more like a slow change in atmosphere, where the certainty they once had about you starts to feel slightly less stable. The same voices that were confident in their judgment begin to soften without openly admitting it. They don't suddenly apologize or announce a change of opinion, but their behavior starts to adjust in subtle ways. The jokes about your vision become less frequent. The dismissive tone starts to fade, and in its place, something more careful begins to appear. It is not respect yet, but it is no longer complete dismissal either. It is observation, and observation always begins when certainty starts to break. What triggers this shift is not one single event, but a gradual accumulation of things they can no longer ignore. Small signs of progress start appearing in your life, not necessarily loud or publicly dramatic, but consistent enough that they begin to stand out against the assumptions they once made. Things you said you would do slowly start aligning with reality, and the version of you they once underestimated no longer matches the evidence that is forming in front of them. And even if they don't openly acknowledge it, their perception starts to recalibrate in the background. This is where the dynamic changes direction without announcement. Because when people realize, even subconsciously, that their earlier judgment might not have been accurate, they don't always admit it directly. Instead, they shift into a different mode of engagement. They start watching more closely. They begin to compare your progress with their expectations. They revisit earlier assumptions and quietly measure them against new information. And in that process, something important happens. Curiosity replaces certainty. The same people who once felt comfortable dismissing your direction now find themselves paying attention to it more than they expected. Not because they suddenly support it, but because they can no longer fully ignore it. And this is where the shift becomes psychologically significant, because attention is the first step before recognition, and recognition begins where doubt starts to lose its grip. Even though they may not openly express it, there is a growing awareness that something is unfolding differently than they originally predicted. Your consistency begins to speak louder than their early assumptions, and your persistence starts creating a pattern they didn't account for. And while they are still processing this internally, without clear language for it, their behavior begins to reflect the change. They start mentioning your progress in passing conversations. They start referencing your actions more often, and they begin to observe your direction with a level of seriousness that didn't exist before. Not because they fully believe in it yet, but because they are no longer confident that their earlier judgment was correct. And in that space between doubt and realization, your presence starts to carry a different weight in their perception. You are no longer just someone they commented on casually. You become someone they are actively trying to understand. And that transition, even if unspoken, marks the beginning of a completely different phase in how they relate to your journey, where dismissal slowly gives way to attention, and attention slowly opens the door to reconsideration. As the gap between their old perception of you and the new reality continues to widen, something even more subtle begins to emerge, something they would never openly admit but can no longer ignore in their behavior. The same people who once felt comfortable dismissing your direction now start to quietly mirror aspects of it. It doesn't happen in an obvious or direct way, and it certainly doesn't come with acknowledgement or credit. Instead, it shows up in fragments, in the way they start talking differently, in the way their choices begin to shift, and in the way certain ideas they once rejected suddenly become part of their thinking. At first, it is almost invisible, easy to dismiss as coincidence or general change over time. But when patterns begin to repeat, it becomes harder to ignore that something has fundamentally shifted in how they relate to what you once represented. Ideas they laughed at before start reappearing in their conversations, not as jokes this time, but as possibilities they are now willing to consider. Approaches they once criticized begin to surface in their actions, sometimes indirectly, sometimes unconsciously, as if they are slowly absorbing elements of your direction without fully realizing where it originated from. And the most interesting part is that they rarely frame it as copying. Instead, they repackage it as growth, realization, or a change in perspective, because admitting influence would require acknowledging that they once underestimated something they are now beginning to respect in practice. This is where perception becomes deeply layered, because from your perspective, nothing about your path has changed in its intention, but from their side, the same path they once dismissed is now being quietly studied and partially adopted. And that creates an unspoken reversal in dynamics. You are no longer just the person whose ideas were questioned. You become the reference point they subconsciously orbit around when reassessing their own choices. Even if they don't openly connect their behavior to you, the influence is still present in the background of their decisions. They might adjust how they approach certain goals, rethink strategies they once ignored, or even reconsider ambitions they previously thought were unrealistic, all while distancing themselves from the idea that those shifts were inspired by what they once mocked. And this contradiction is where the psychological tension lies. Because internally, there is a recognition forming that what was once dismissed might have had more value than they originally admitted. But externally, there is resistance to fully acknowledging that realization. So instead, the influence gets diluted, redistributed, and reframed in a way that allows them to adopt it without confronting its origin. Meanwhile, your role in this process remains unchanged. You continue moving forward without adjusting your direction based on their attention or lack of it. You are not reacting to their shift. You are simply progressing beyond the point where their early judgment was formed. And that is what makes the dynamic so unbalanced. Because while they are still processing your earlier stages and slowly integrating aspects of your path into their own thinking, you are already operating in a newer phase of development that they have not yet reached. So even their imitation, whether conscious or not, always arrives slightly behind your evolution. And over time, this creates a quiet realization within them that the version of you they once judged is no longer accessible to them in the same way. Because by the time they begin to understand it, you are already several steps ahead of it. As this entire cycle reaches its final stage, something becomes quietly undeniable, even if no one ever openly states it. The distance between who you were when they first formed their opinion and who you have become now is no longer small enough to ignore or casually reinterpret. What once started as mockery, doubt, or dismissal has transformed into something far more complex on their side, a mixture of observation, silent comparison, and reluctant acknowledgement. And yet, from your perspective, the most important shift is not what they think, but what you no longer need from them. Because by this point, your progress is no longer shaped in response to their perception. You are not adjusting, proving, or reacting. You are simply continuing forward in a direction that was built long before their attention returned to it. And that is where the real separation exists. They are still trying to process the earlier version of you, the one they thought they understood, while you are already operating beyond that stage entirely. This creates a strange imbalance, where their awareness of you lags behind your actual development. Even when they begin to recognize your growth, it arrives in fragments, not as a complete understanding, but as disconnected observations that never fully form a clear picture of your journey. And because of that, their realization is always incomplete. They see results without fully understanding the process. They see direction without fully understanding the discipline behind it. And they see confidence without fully understanding the internal transformation that created it. Meanwhile, what they once dismissed as unrealistic or exaggerated has now become part of their reference point, whether they admit it or not. But by the time this realization settles in, it no longer holds the same weight it once would have, because your focus is no longer positioned around being seen or validated. You have already moved past the stage where recognition was the goal. And that is what ultimately changes everything. The same voices that once questioned your vision are now quietly recalibrating their understanding of what they thought was possible, but you are no longer standing in the place where their validation matters. You have already stepped into a different level of execution, where attention is secondary to progress. And in that space, the earlier narrative they built about you loses its relevance, not because it was confronted directly, but because it was simply outgrown. What remains is a quiet truth that doesn't need to be announced or proven, that perception always trails behind reality. And by the time others begin to understand what you were doing, you're already focused on what comes next,